The humid air of the Vietnamese swamp clung to Sergeant Mike Thompson like a wet blanket as he crouched behind the twisted roots of an ancient cypress tree. It was 3:27 a.m., and the darkness was so thick he could barely see his own hands. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of murky water against the shore and the distant chirping of night insects. But something felt wrong. Very wrong. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. Thompson had been leading reconnaissance missions for 8 months, and his gut instincts had kept him and his men alive through countless dangerous operations. Tonight, those same instincts were screaming at him to get his squad out of this god-forsaken swamp immediately. He pressed his radio closer to his mouth and whispered barely audible words to his team. Private First Class Jake Williams was positioned 50 yards to the north, his rifle scope scanning the tree line for any movement. Corporal Danny Martinez held the southern flank, while Private Tommy Chen watched their 6. They had been tracking enemy movement reports for 3 days, following intelligence that suggested Viet Cong forces were using this remote swamp as a supply route. What they found instead was something far more terrifying than enemy soldiers. The first sign of trouble came at 4:15 a.m. Williams reported seeing what looked like a person moving through the water, about 200 yards away, but when he looked through his scope again, nothing was there. Martinez heard strange splashing sounds that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, but every time he turned toward the noise, the swamp fell silent. Chen swore he saw muzzle flashes in the distance, but no gunshots echoed through the humid air. Thompson knew his men were experienced fighters, not the type to jump at shadows or imagine things that were not there. If they were reporting strange activity, something was definitely happening. He decided to move the squad to higher ground and get a better view of the situation. As they began to relocate, Private Chen suddenly froze and raised his hand for silence. From somewhere in the black water came a sound that made every man's blood run cold. It was not the splash of someone walking through the swamp or the gentle movement of water against land. It was the deliberate, calculated sound of someone moving with purpose, someone who knew exactly how to navigate the treacherous terrain without making unnecessary noise. Someone who was hunting. Williams adjusted his night vision scope and began scanning the area where the sound had originated. Through the green-tinted display, he could make out the twisted shapes of cypress trees and hanging moss, but nothing that looked human. Then for just a split second he saw it. A figure moving between the trees with fluid, almost ghostly precision. The shape seemed to glide rather than walk, never disturbing the water or vegetation around it. Thompson gathered his men into a tight defensive position on a small rise that offered better visibility in fields of fire. They had trained for ambush situations, but this felt different. Usually when facing enemy forces, there were signs of their presence. Footprints, disturbed vegetation, equipment left behind, or at least the normal sounds of people moving through difficult terrain. This phantom left no trace. At 5:43 a.m., just as the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the canopy, Martinez spotted something that made his hands shake. Through his binoculars he could see what appeared to be a sniper, positioned in a tree about 300 yards away. The figure was perfectly camouflaged and remained completely motionless, but Martinez was certain he was looking at a human form. He reported the sighting to Thompson, who immediately moved to confirm the target. When Thompson looked through his own binoculars at the exact location Martinez had indicated, he saw nothing but empty branches and hanging moss. Frustrated, he passed the binoculars back to Martinez, who looked again and insisted the sniper was still there. Thompson realized they were dealing with an enemy who possessed skills far beyond anything they had encountered before. The psychological pressure began to mount as the morning progressed. Every shadow could be hiding a threat. Every sound might be the enemy moving into position for an attack. The men found themselves constantly spinning around, convinced they were being watched from multiple directions simultaneously. Williams reported seeing muzzle flashes from at least 6 different positions, but when the other squad members looked at those same locations, they saw nothing. Thompson made the decision to call for backup, but when he tried to radio their base camp, all he received was static. Their communications equipment had been working perfectly just hours before, but now it seemed completely dead. The isolation was complete. They were alone in hostile territory with an enemy who seemed to possess almost supernatural abilities. Chen suddenly grabbed Thompson's arm and pointed toward the water. About 100 yards away, they could all see what looked like a person standing waist-deep in the murky swamp. The figure was completely still, and even through binoculars they could not make out any details. It seemed to be watching them, but from that distance it was impossible to tell if it was friend or foe. Thompson decided to take action. He instructed Williams to keep the mysterious figure in his sights while he and Martinez attempted to flank the position. Chen would remain at their current location to provide covering fire if needed. It was a standard tactical maneuver, but nothing about this situation felt standard. As Thompson and Martinez began their approach, moving carefully through the thick vegetation, the figure in the water simply vanished. One moment it was there, clearly visible to all four Marines, and the next moment the water was empty. There had been no splash, no movement, no indication of where the person had gone. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. Williams kept his rifle trained on the area where the figure had been standing, but his scope revealed nothing except empty water and floating debris. The silence was deafening. Even the insects had stopped chirping, and the swamp seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of what would happen next. At 7:18 a.m., their worst fears were realized. Williams suddenly shouted that he could see a rifle barrel protruding from a clump of vegetation about 250 yards away. The barrel was aimed directly at their position, and he could see the distinctive outline of a scope mounted on top. This was definitely a sniper, and they were in his crosshairs. Thompson ordered his men to take cover immediately, but before they could move, Williams screamed that the sniper had moved to a completely different position on the opposite side of their location. Martinez confirmed he could also see the rifle, but when he looked through his scope, the weapon seemed to be in yet another position entirely. It was impossible. No one could move that quickly through difficult terrain while carrying a precision rifle. The terror reached its peak when all four Marines simultaneously reported seeing different snipers in different locations. Williams saw one to the north, Martinez spotted one to the south, Chen identified one to the east, and Thompson could clearly see one position to the west. They were surrounded, but the sightings made no tactical sense. If there really were four enemy snipers, they would have already opened fire. The fact that no shots were being fired suggested something else was happening. Thompson realized they were dealing with a single individual who possessed extraordinary camouflage and movement skills. This phantom sniper was deliberately revealing himself just enough to create psychological pressure, without actually engaging in combat. It was a form of warfare they had never encountered before, designed to break their morale and force them into making mistakes. The cat-and-mouse game continued for another 2 hours. The phantom would appear in one location just long enough to be spotted, then vanish and reappear somewhere else entirely. Sometimes he seemed to be in impossible positions, like standing on water or floating among the tree branches. The Marines began to question their own sanity as the sightings became increasingly bizarre. At 9:35 a.m., Chen made a discovery that changed everything. While scanning the swamp with his binoculars, he noticed something strange about the water patterns. There were subtle ripples moving through the area in a way that suggested someone was using the water itself as concealment. The phantom was not disappearing and reappearing in different locations. He was moving beneath the surface using reeds and floating vegetation to breathe, while remaining almost completely submerged. This revelation explained how the sniper could move so quickly between positions without being detected. The murky water provided perfect concealment, and years of experience had taught him exactly how to navigate the underwater terrain. He was not supernatural after all, just incredibly skilled at using his environment to maximum advantage. Armed with this new understanding, Thompson developed a plan to flush out their tormentor. Instead of trying to track his movements, they would force him to reveal himself by cutting off his escape routes. Martinez would move to block the deepest part of the channel, while Williams covered the shallow areas. Chen and Thompson would create a disturbance that would force the phantom to move, hopefully into one of their fields of fire. The plan worked better than they had hoped. At 10:52 a.m., their coordinated movement forced the hidden sniper to surface near a fallen log about 120 yards away. For the first time, they got a clear look at their phantom. He was a thin, wiry man, probably in his 40s, with skin darkened by years of sun exposure and wearing improvised camouflage that perfectly matched the swamp environment. What impressed Thompson most was not the man's appearance, but his equipment. The rifle he carried was a modified version that had been specially adapted for swamp warfare. The barrel had been treated to prevent rust and the scope was wrapped in waterproof material. Even his ammunition was stored in sealed containers that would allow him to remain submerged for extended periods. This was clearly someone who had spent years perfecting his craft. The phantom sniper realized he had been discovered and made no attempt to hide. Instead, he raised his hand slowly, indicating surrender. As the Marines approached cautiously, they could see he was smiling slightly as if he had enjoyed their deadly game of hide-and-seek. When Thompson was close enough to speak, the man said in heavily accented English that he had been watching them since they entered the swamp 3 days earlier. He explained that he was not Viet Cong as they had assumed, but a local hunter who had been displaced by the war. The swamp had been his home for decades, and he knew every inch of the treacherous terrain. When armed soldiers entered his territory, he had decided to test their skills rather than simply attack them. It was his way of determining whether they were worthy opponents or just another group of inexperienced troops who would not survive long in the hostile environment. The revelation that their phantom sniper had been playing with them rather than trying to kill them was both relieving and humbling. Thompson realized they had encountered someone whose wilderness skills far exceeded anything they had learned in military training. This man could have eliminated their entire squad at any point during the past several hours, but had chosen instead to teach them a lesson about respecting the dangerous environment they were operating in. As they prepared to leave the swamp, the phantom sniper offered them some advice about surviving in similar terrain. He pointed out mistakes they had made in their positioning and movement that had made them easy targets. He showed them how to read water patterns to detect hidden movement and how to use natural camouflage more effectively. It was like receiving a masterclass in jungle warfare from someone who had spent his entire life perfecting these skills. The Marines left the swamp with a new respect for the challenges they faced in unfamiliar territory. They had entered believing their military training would be sufficient to handle any situation, but had learned there were skills and knowledge that could only be acquired through years of living in harmony with a specific environment. The phantom sniper had taught them this lesson without firing a single shot, making it far more memorable than any conventional training exercise. Thompson filed his report about the encounter, but he knew that no written document could capture the psychological impact of their experience. They had faced an enemy who seemed to possess almost supernatural abilities, only to discover that those abilities were simply the result of intimate knowledge and respect for the natural world. It was a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their military service and beyond. The story of the phantom sniper spread quickly through their unit, becoming part of the oral tradition that soldiers use to share important lessons with their comrades. It served as a reminder that in warfare, the most dangerous enemies are often those who understand the terrain better than you do, and that survival sometimes depends more on wisdom and patience than on superior firepower or advanced equipment. Years later, when Thompson was training new recruits, he would tell them about the morning in the Vietnamese swamp when his squad spent hours playing deadly hide-and-seek with a ghost who turned out to be a master teacher. It was a story that perfectly illustrated the importance of respecting both the environment and the enemy, and understanding that the most effective weapons are often knowledge, experience, and the ability to become one with your surroundings.